Analyzing Canadian identity and rights, the exclusion of Indigenous worldviews and voices has been noted and condemned by First Nation leaders and scholars. The very model of multiculturalism has, whether purposely or inadvertently, ignored the position of Indigenous peoples as sovereign nations with distinct identities and non-negotiable presence. It makes one wonder, how can Indigenous perspectives inform and lead discussions on multiculturalism when the discourse is firmly entrenched in a colonial framework? Gilara?
Thank you, Natalia. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Je m'appelle Silata Ravi et je suis directrice de l'Institut Marcel et Louis Desrochers pour le patrimoine et les recherches transdisciplinaires en francophonie canadienne et internationale du campus Saint-Jean. Le campus Saint-Jean, c'est le campus francophone de l'Université de l'Alberta et l'IMELDA, cet institut, est très fier d'être partenaire de ce colloque. On est en 2022, plus de 50 ans depuis l'adoption de la politique officielle du multiculturalisme. Au cours de 3 journées de délibération depuis l'inauguration du colloque en novembre dernier, nous nous sommes posé des questions sur l'héritage colonial au Canada, les relations des peuples autochtones avec la terre, les réponses aux appels de l'action de la Commission de la vérité et de la réconciliation, l'avenir des communautés en situation minoritaire linguistique et surtout, en quoi ces questionnements influencent la notion d'être canadien ou canadienne. Aujourd'hui, la 4e et dernière journée de la conférence, nous nous réunissons ici, partager nos pensées et nos espoirs pour l'avenir de ce pays. Reflecting on the ideas shared in our previous symposium sessions, as Natalia outlined here, I feel it is important for us to circle back to the questions initially raised when planning first began for this event. Our organizing committee, in conversation with the University of Alberta Situated Knowledge's Indigenous Peoples and Place, signature area, had felt it vital to invite top thinkers and practitioners to consider the following. Is there room for multiculturalism as conceived in 1971 and later modified in these new negotiations of what constitutes Canada and Canadian identity? Can the long-established discourse on multiculturalism developed from the viewpoint of settler colonialism engage with and bring into the center of the debate Indigenous perspectives, ways of knowing, and notions of nationhood existing in this land that we now call Canada? And in 2022, is it possible for Francophone Canadians and other ethnic and visible minority groups to continue to dialogue about the multiculturalism policies, various outcomes, and colonial nature in the effort to understand what it means to be Canadian? I'm so pleased to see how these questions were taken up by the symposium participants and considered from their particular disciplines, from their perspectives, and from their own practices. Today's roundtable will certainly be no different, with our presenters focusing on special lens on how these sorts of questions are being addressed on the ground in everyday Edmonton experiences. As community stakeholders, these roundtable panel members will help shift our gaze towards how policy works out in the real world and to how listening, understanding, and creating relationship with one's neighbor are often the first and the most important steps in the process towards reconciliation. Je suis vraiment très honorée et ravie de présenter notre présidente pour la table ronde, Dr. Olenka Bilash. Olenka Bilash will first share with us some technical information and then acquaint us with the presenters of our roundtable panel. Merci, Dr. Bilash.
Merci, bienvenue. Welcome, everyone. My name is Olenka Bilash, and I'm a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. I teach courses on intercultural competency, second language education, and just almost a year ago, coordinated a conference or a symposium on the impact of multiculturalism on public education. And I'm very interested in this event because of all the work that needs to take place and continues to take place between academics and communities. I'm very pleased to be joining you for another session of Reconciling Multiculturalism in Today's Canada. and would like to begin with some details. So the format for today's symposium sessions will consist of one 3-hour roundtable with 6 unique presentations. Each presentation will last approximately 15 minutes. At the closing of the presentations, the floor will be open to comments, discussions, and questions. As an audience, you are encouraged to be active participants in the discussion. Questions and comments can be posed in the chat box at any time, although these will not be addressed until the question and answer session at the end of the 6 presentations. We ask that your comments remain respectful and, as much as possible, brief. Once the floor is open to discussion, you may also choose to pose an audio question. To do this, please ensure your camera and microphone are switched on and use the raise hand feature found along the bottom of your Zoom screen to get my attention. Questions will be taken in the order hands appear, although we may not be able to accommodate all questions. We will certainly do our best. Note that auto transcription will be on for the majority of the roundtable, which you will be able to access by choosing the small CC button in your Zoom controls. However, our second presenter will speak in French, and due to the constraints of our technology, we will not be able to have auto transcription for that portion of the session. We will, at a later date, make the recording of this roundtable available along with copy-edited transcripts. Finally, I wish to bring to your attention the discussion lounge that will be open and available to all participants directly after the conclusion of the roundtable. This breakout room, which will later be highlighted as an option to join within our Zoom meeting controls, and to which all roundtable attendees will be transferred at the end of the session, will allow you to visit and network with your fellow attendees. Please do not feel shy to use the discussion lounge, as we wish for it to be a space where the current conversation can continue in a more relaxed fashion. Because we cannot convene in person, the discussion lounge has served as an alternative to the coffee break and mingling time one would enjoy in a non-virtual symposium environment. This session will conclude no later than 12:30 p.m., but you are encouraged to remain and talk. To open this roundtable, we will first hear a short message from Edmonton Mayor Amarjeet Sohi. Having assumed his current office on October 26, 2021, Mayor Sohi is new to the role of mayor, but is no stranger to community and political leadership. He previously served as an Edmonton City Councillor from 2010 to 2015, after which he assumed the position of Member of Parliament for Edmonton Mill Woods until 2019. Mayor Sohi's love for his city is evident in his words, and his story is a compelling snapshot of the immigrant and Canadian multicultural experiences. Without further delay, I now welcome His Worship, Mayor Amarjeet Sohi.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to bring greetings on behalf of the city of Edmonton and all Edmontonians. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 6 territory, that we are all treaty people. I'm honored to speak on a topic that is very important to me, that is multiculturalism. 50 years ago, Canada created the first official multiculturalism policy. And this policy sparked a new wave of inclusivity across our country. In Canada, our diversity and celebration of cultures is what makes us unique to other countries. Edmonton in particular is a city that celebrates multiculturalism. However, we are still working toward our goal of being a more inclusive and cohesive for both newcomers and all other Edmontonians. I faced challenges when I first arrived in Edmonton linked to my race, but I was also accepted by many, including people working in the arts community. I'm hopeful that Edmonton will become a more accepting city, one where newcomers feel safe and supported to start a new life here. A city where Indigenous people can feel heard and understood. We can accomplish this by living the values of mutual respect, responsibility, and the renewal to build and maintain strong relationships between Edmontonians and Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation is key to growth and forgiveness, as it provides education to our harmful past and how we can make the present and future better. Working together, all Edmontonians can make our city a more accepting place to live. I want to thank you at the University of Alberta's Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies for organizing this symposium. The work directly contributes to changing the attitudes and beliefs of many people across our country. I wish you all a day filled with important dialogue that will help reinforce the importance of multiculturalism in Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Sohi. I now welcome our first panel presenter, Carrie Auger. Carrie is a Nehiyao Iskwu, originally from Treaty 8 territory, Wabasca Big Stone Cree Nation. She is the acting senior manager of Indigenous Relations and Supports at Northwest College in Edmonton. Some of her other hard work is in facilitating creative writing classes with Indigenous men inside prisons. And she is a community organizer who helps bring attention to the harms of the penal system. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's really lovely to see all of your faces on this winter morning. I am going to get my presentation all ready to go here. So I wanted to start today in gratitude of my relations, the land, all that is of the land, human and other than human, in gratitude of our ancestors who paved the way for us to do this work. I want to recognize Treaty 6 territory, Métis Region 4, and other forms of treaty between Indigenous peoples and other than human nations in this place. I want to recognize the many diverse Indigenous peoples that have gathered here since time immemorial. I want to recognize that I'm responsible to my people, to the land, to the people gathered here today, and to all of our communities. I want to recognize that I'm accountable for unpacking my own biases, unlearning and learning, and that I'm accountable to maintain Wekotwin while knowing that all of my actions and inactions have ripple effects outwards, affecting all of our relations. So a little bit about me. So I'm the acting senior manager of Indigenous Relations and Supports at Northwest College. And I'm really, really lucky and grateful to work with an all Indigenous team of about 15 of us. I'm also really grateful to have a surprisingly large amount of support from the institution to support our strategic direction and dream of a decolonial Indigenous future. I'm also a grassroots organizer, a public educator, creating awareness of the harms of prison and policing, and a creative writing facilitator with Indigenous men inside prisons. And I'm also a poet. So just a brief overview of the presentation. I'm presenting on erasure of Indigenous peoples and multiculturalism, no recognition, no reconciliation. So I'm just going to do a very brief overview of the white paper and the Indigenous response to the white paper, really focusing on Harold Cardinal's work from the Unjust Society. I then move into talking about the importance of recognition in two areas, the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. I'll then take a look and use the framework of the indigenization spectrum as articulated by Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz, and the post-TRC rise in indigenization and decolonization, and how we understand inclusion policies within our institutions, and then reconciliation and the rise in treaty land acknowledgements. I'm then going to finish with decolonial possibilities, looking at a treaty-based model of relationality and Indigenous resurgence. So just a brief overview. The white paper was introduced in 1969, 2 years before the multicultural policy by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Minister of Indian Affairs John Crescent. This was an assimilatory policy that would have abolished the Indian Act and eliminated treaty Indigenous rights. sorry, excuse me. This was proposed as because there was a belief that the Indian Act was a discriminatory policy, so positively advantaging Indigenous peoples. So through extinguishing of Indigenous rights, it was proposed that it would equal a just and equal participation for Indigenous peoples into Canadian society. The paper was widely refused across Indigenous nations, across so-called Canada. And really what this was also was an assertion of indigeneity in all its forms. So Indigenous cultures, languages, and worldviews, Indigenous sovereignty and rights to self-determination, and Indigenous governance and laws. Sorry, just give me 1 second here. The little bar at the top is covering some of my presentation, so it's hard to see some of it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the ongoing fight for reconciliation. So I really think about two things when I'm talking about recognition. The first of them is truth-telling. So truth-telling about the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people through the colonial project. And the second part is legality. So Indigenous laws and governance systems, and recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and Indigenous resurgence. So I wanted to start from this place. So as I said, I was using The Unjust Society written by Harold Cardinal as a response to the white paper, and lots has happened in between that time. But I wanted to start from here because a lot of the conversation we have about reconciliation has started from this place. So obviously with the 2015 TRC calls to action, we have a rise in awareness of Canada's assimilation and genocidal policies. And really what we've coming to understand and know is not just the historical impacts of residential schools, but really the legacy and ongoing violence from these schools and how we can come to understand them through the child welfare system, the so-called justice system, including prisons and policing, the education system, and the healthcare system as well. So with the rise in awareness of the residential school system, there also became a rise in indigenization within post-secondary institutions and other institutions. So Gaudry and Lorenz articulate that social institutions are, for the most part, invested in Indigenous erasure and marginalization, or at least they had been until we really took up this conversation around reconciliation. And Gaudry and Lorenz talk about indigenization as existing on a spectrum. On one side, we get Indigenous inclusion, and on the other side, we get decolonial indigenization. And indigenization inclusion is really about an increase in the numbers of Indigenous peoples, but there's still an expectation for them to adapt to Western or colonial culture. Within reconciliation, indigenization, it really seeks a common ground between Indigenous peoples and Canadian ideals. And ultimately, it aims to change behaviors and attitudes and shape relationships between non-Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have decolonial indigenization. And really, this is about a balancing of power relations and a complete transformation of the institution itself and the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So some of the way that I wanted to talk about inclusion policies is thinking about indigenized strategies within an institution, if there is one, and often how it's housed, imagined, or understood within equity, diversity, and inclusion policies. And what I wanted to bring to attention here was that under this framework, it often will perpetuate the same ideals as multiculturalism. So there's a really strong focus on diversity within an overarching institutional culture. Often these are sought and practiced as equality measures, not equity-seeking ones, despite equity in the title. And for Indigenous peoples, what this acts to do is it's an erasure of Indigenous rights to sovereignty and self-determination. One of the ways that we can understand reconciliation, indigenization, is through treaty land acknowledgements. And not to say that there's no transformative power whatsoever in treaty land acknowledgements, but with the rise of treaty land acknowledgements becoming a standard policy and procedure across many social institutions, they've really become symbolic to the larger relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. So there's a really big lack of substantive understanding in Indigenous tenets of treaty and Indigenous law and governance systems. And ultimately, there's really a lack of accountability to Indigenous peoples in them, in recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and really recognizing the deliberate misinterpretation of the treaties, theft of land, and the ongoing dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples. So this is my heart work, is the decolonial futures. And we really, at my institution, we've really used Gaudry and Lorenz's articulation of decolonial indigenization as a path forward. And I want to offer it here today for everyone in considering how they might take up this work in the future in their own roles and positions and institutions. And I titled it Imagining and Remembering. And the reason why I titled it that is because I'm also an abolitionist at heart. And a lot of that work is about imagining new futures, new systems of care, new ways that we can relate to and love each other. But there's also, for Indigenous peoples, a remembering and a reclaiming of things that we've always known that have been in our bodies and our spirits and our communities. And so those two things together create what I'm hoping for a decolonial future. So when we talk about this at our institution, we'll often refer to the two-row wampum, and this is a Haudenosaunee way of treaty. And the way that I understand it, as minimal as I do, is that it's imagined as two canoes or two vessels, and these vessels are going down a river side by side, but they're not interfering with each other. So on the same path, but going separately. And so I titled this Separate Canoes and Shared River. And when I talked about this in presentations at my institution, somebody recently brought up, he was like, well, how do we collaborate if we're in different boats going down the river? Like, is there no room for that? And I was like, you know what? I was like, just because we're going down in different canoes doesn't mean that we can't stop on the riverbank and feast together, that we can't talk to each other, that we can't communicate, that if your boat has a hole in it, and I have a cup, I can't throw it your way so that you can, get the water out of your boat. But what it means is that no one in that boat has any right to tell the person in this boat who can be in that boat, how fast that boat is going, what they're carrying in that boat. So they're really two separate sovereign peoples going down that path together. And so we use this idea of a treaty-based model of relationality. And what that really means for us within an institution is that it requires power sharing, and that we really hold constant this idea of principles of non-interference. A lot of the work that has been taken up in indigenization in institutions is often from this consultation viewpoint. And so it's always after the fact, to get Indigenous peoples to sign on or sign off to something. And we really want to move away from this idea and move more to a collaborative process. And the way that we like to think about it is nothing about us without us. So anytime anything could have impacts for an Indigenous person or Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples are at that table as equal nations, as sharing the power to make the decisions that affect their communities. And Harold Cardinal said in his book that Indian involvement means Indian participation right from the initial discussion. And I want to point to the importance, finally, of Indigenous resurgence within this work. So I have this beautiful quote from Aubrey Jean Hansen from Reading Reconciliation. And she says, resurgence, unlike reconciliation, constitutes a socio-culture movement and theoretical framework that concentrates on regeneration within Indigenous communities. It validates Indigenous knowledges, cultures, histories, ingenuity, and continuity. Although colonialism is acknowledged, relations between Indigenous peoples and settler colonizers are not centered in resurgence. Instead, resurgence focuses on Indigenous communities as sites of power and regeneration. It is about people in their own communities, nourishing their own traditions, languages, worldviews, stories, knowledges, and ways of being. And I want to talk a little bit about resurgence within grassroots movements and how we might understand them as expressions of Indigenous sovereignty. In particular, I'm thinking about blockades, things like Indigenous blockades, encampments, mutual aid projects, and all kinds of grassroots protests, and how we need to start understanding these movements as being guided by Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and ultimately guided by Indigenous governance and law. And what people are doing when they are engaging in grassroots movements like this is that they're providing a culturally responsive solution and a system of care that allows us to assert our rights as Indigenous peoples to take care of our relations the way that they deserve to be taken care of. So Harold Cardinal says that before we can take our place in a larger society, we must regain our own confidence and self-respect. To do this, we must be allowed to rebuild our own social institutions torn down by their white counterparts. We must rebuild our structures of social and political leadership, demoralized and undermined for 100 years by the Department of Indian Affairs. We must restore our family unit, shaken and shattered by the residential school system. We must rebuild communities between the younger and older generations of our people. We must recognize that the negative images of Indians are false. The Canadian government must realize that assimilation, no matter what they call it, will never work. Both Indian and non-Indian must realize that there is a valid, lasting Indian identity. And I wanted to finish my presentation today with a poem I wrote for Canada 150. I am Nihiel, an Indigenous person of this land, from this land here. We are here and always have been. I do not celebrate Canada Day because I am only Canadian in policies and laws that do not recognize my inherent rights to exist as a Nihiel. And I choose not to recognize a country built on genocide, on broken treaties and deception. I am of the Nihiel nation, a nation that signed treaties that in good faith and by our natural laws said we would walk side by side, never interfering. This did not happen. Instead of respecting the Indigenous peoples of this land, the Canadian government has done everything it can to destroy Indigenous peoples along their home, this beautiful Eski we call Turtle Island. But we are a strong people. Our many nations, sovereign nations, have been resisting for 150 years. And we will continue to resist to protect our people, our relatives on Turtle Island. So no, I do not celebrate Canada, a country that has systematically attempted with violence to take my inherent right to know what it means to be Nihiel. It was a long journey home, lost in colonial shame, that taught me I was a savage, only salvaged through violent assimilation into a civilized Canadian. And I believed it for most of my life because the colonial narrative is loud, but we are louder in our songs, in our drumbeat heartbeat. Across this great land, it will be felt on this day and every day. So no, I do not celebrate being Canadian today because I am not Canadian. I am Nihiel, Indigenous to this land, of this land. We are here and always will be. Thank you. Can I ask something?
Thank you, Carrie, for sharing your heart work with us today. I'd like to now introduce Alphonse Ahola. Alphonse is the executive director of FRAP, the Francophonie Albertaine Plurielle. FRAP is the Francophone Settlement Agency for the cities of Edmonton and Fort McMurray. Alphonse's community commitment has led him to the position of Vice President External for the Graduate Students Association of the University of Alberta, Chair of the Board of Directors of La FRAP, and Chair of the Francophone Immigration Network of Alberta, RIFA. He is also a member of the National Advisory Committee for Francophone Settlement. Please note that Alphonse will be presenting in French. If you require it, you can find instructions on how to access simultaneous English language interpretation in the chat. The secondary audio channel with interpretation will remain open for the duration of Alphonse's talk. Without further ado, bienvenue, Alphonse.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Je suis très heureux de prendre part à ce symposium et je dois souligner qu'en tant que francophone, la question du multiculturalisme est une question extrêmement importante parce que on parle de beaucoup de minorités au Canada, mais je voudrais signaler que la minorité francophone, notamment dans sa danse africaine, est très peu souvent prise en compte. Pourtant, c'est un problème sérieux que nous rencontrons ici en tant que francophones. Nous sommes une sorte de minorité dans la minorité. Et la présentation que je vais faire ici se situe dans ce contexte-là, c'est-à-dire un contexte dans lequel nous avons eu une francophonie qui s'est construite en dehors évidemment de nous et qui s'est construite sans nous et qui s'est surprise un matin à nous voir arriver et qui jusqu'à aujourd'hui continue à réfléchir sur la meilleure façon de nous intégrer dans ce contexte-ci. Et c'est extrêmement important pour nous. Pourquoi? Parce que ça pose en réalité la question de où sommes-nous, quelle est notre place ici et comment est-ce qu'on peut la construire, cette place. Alors, ces questions, nous nous les sommes posées depuis que je suis arrivé au Canada. Je sais que des gens se sont posés cette question avant moi, mais quand je suis arrivé, par la frappe, j'ai contribué de façon assez forte dans ces enjeux de multiculturalisme. Donc, je vais vous présenter rapidement, en 15 minutes, ce que nous avons fait pendant tout ce temps. D'abord, la première chose que j'aimerais souligner, c'est que je voudrais vous faire une petite présentation de la politique multiculturelle dans la francophonie albertaine lors de la création de la frappe en 2014. La première chose que vous remarquerez, c'est qu'à cette époque-là, les communautés immigrantes étaient peu ou pas associées aux activités et à la gestion des organismes communautaires. C'était déjà le cas avant, mais nous l'avons constaté même en 2014. Les membres les immigrants étaient très peu associés aux activités ou à la gestion de ces organismes. Et les immigrants étaient considérés comme des clients, sans plus. C'est-à-dire, dans le contexte francophone, les immigrants qui arrivaient étaient considérés comme des clients, sans plus. Donc, c'était, si vous voulez, une opportunité pour les organisations qui étaient déjà là de pouvoir augmenter leur clientèle et chercher des ressources. Mais toutes ces organisations, ou bien les grands acteurs de l'époque, n'anticipaient pas que sur le potentiel et le rôle que vont jouer ces immigrants dans le renouvellement de la francophonie. Ça, c'était complètement hors de question à l'époque parce qu'on ne voyait pas que ces gens qui viennent vont certainement changer la donne. C'était le cas, par exemple, dans les écoles, où on voyait que les autorités scolaires se contentaient de recruter les enfants des immigrants qui arrivaient, mais ils ne songeaient en réalité jamais à augmenter le nombre des enseignants, le nombre d'enseignants immigrants pour équilibrer au moins la population d'élèves avec celle des enseignants. Donc ça, ce n'était pas à l'ordre du jour. Par ailleurs, les immigrants qualifiés arrivaient en nombre en 2010. Parce qu'avant 2010, ce qu'il faut bien comprendre, c'est qu'on avait un certain nombre d'immigrants d'origine subsaharienne, mais très souvent, la plupart d'entre eux étaient réfugiés. Il y en avait qui ne l'étaient pas, mais la plupart étaient réfugiés ou venaient d'Europe. Mais à partir d'un certain moment, on voit des immigrants qualifiés arriver en grand nombre au niveau de l'Alberta et notamment dans la francophonie. Alors, ces immigrants se posent la question, mais quel est notre rôle au juste dans cette francophonie? Et qu'est-ce que nous allons devenir dans cette francophonie dans laquelle apparemment nous n'avons pas de place? C'est de là que justement naît la frappe. La frappe naît de ces préoccupations parce que ces immigrants vont se réunir et vont se dire, mais à cette allure-là, il faut bien qu'on s'organise. Si on ne s'organise pas, quelle sera notre place dans ce contexte-ci? Donc, ça, c'était le contexte de l'époque. Alors, l'autre chose, c'est que le réseau d'immigration francophone, qui est en réalité, qui a le rôle de coordination si vous voulez, des actions. C'est une table de discussion entre les organismes francophones sur les enjeux de l'établissement. Alors, mais ce réseau était entre les mains de l'ACFA, l'Association canadienne-française de l'Alberta, et donc le réseau était manifestement sous la responsabilité des gens qui n'avaient aucune expérience vécue de l'immigration, et avec les conséquences que cela peut entraîner. Ensuite, on avait un statu quo peu soucié d'améliorer le service aux immigrants. Je viens de le signaler, par exemple, le statu quo était tel que les immigrants étaient considérés comme simplement des clients et on n'avait pas vraiment le souci ici d'améliorer les services qu'on offrait à ces gens. Et ça a créé une sorte de frustration. Quand nous sommes arrivés ici, moi je suis arrivé au Canada en 2013, à mon arrivée, j'ai constaté que tous les immigrants qui arrivaient étaient mis dans le même sac. Malgré mon niveau intellectuel, malgré mon background, malgré toute l'expérience que j'apportais, j'étais mis vraiment dans un sac dans lequel je ne me reconnaissais pas. Au point où j'avais parfois l'impression que ceux qui me recevaient et tentaient de m'aider avaient plutôt besoin de mon aide. C'était assez frustrant. Alors, il y avait aussi, malheureusement à l'époque, et ce n'est pas fini, malheureusement, il y avait des réserves vis-à-vis des immigrants d'ascendance africaine. Les immigrants d'ascendance africaine souffraient de préjugés, comme souvent, notamment au sujet de leurs compétences. Sont-ils vraiment francophones? On nous posait la question, êtes-vous vraiment francophone? Et est-ce que vous pouvez vraiment enseigner en Alberta? Parce que vous venez des sociétés dans lesquelles on ne négocie pas avec les enfants, on est violent contre les enfants, on ne donne que des instructions aux enfants. Mais ici, chez nous, en Alberta, c'est la négociation, c'est ceci. Nous pensons que vous n'êtes pas capable de vous adapter à ce qu'on fait ici en Alberta. Donc ça, c'est des choses qui nous ont été, excusez-moi, ça sont des choses qui nous ont été dites à cette époque-là. Alors, quelles sont les actions que nous avons menées? Parce que face à cette situation-là, c'était manifestement très difficile de pouvoir réellement faire valoir notre expérience, notre culture dans un contexte comme celui-ci. Et c'est là où se pose tout le problème du multiculturalisme. Parce que nous venons dans une société qui a ses valeurs, qui a ses lois, qui a sa façon d'être, mais qui en même temps reconnaît que chacun dans ce contexte-ci, canadien, a le droit de vivre selon sa culture, dans la mesure où cela est compatible avec la loi. Mais alors, comment faire dans ces conditions-là pour pouvoir véritablement poser le problème que nous avions alors? Alors, nous avons mis en place nous avons pris un certain nombre d'initiatives. La première initiative que nous avons faite, c'est qu'en 2014 notamment, nous avons protesté contre la discrimination dans les écoles. À l'époque, la situation a beaucoup changé maintenant, mais à l'époque, il y avait une faible représentation des communautés immigrantes dans le personnel scolaire. Ce n'est pas encore l'idéal, on en est encore loin, mais il y a eu quand même un certain nombre de progrès. Les parents se plaignaient à l'époque d'être mal accueillis dans les écoles. Parce que vous savez, les mamans, par exemple, avaient beaucoup de problèmes avec le lunch qu'on envoyait à l'école pour les enfants. Parfois, le lunch vous revenait ou on vous convoquait à l'école pour vous dire que la nourriture que vous servez à votre enfant n'est pas la bonne nourriture et que vous devez apprendre comment servir la nourriture aux enfants, la bonne nourriture à servir. Et on vous le disait dans un ton qui vous montrait manifestement que vous avez tout à apprendre et que bien que vous ayez nourri des enfants et des enfants, vous ne savez toujours pas comment s'occuper d'une famille. Et ça, c'était vraiment frustrant pour les mamans et pour les parents immigrants. Alors, face à cette situation, nous allons commencer à négocier avec le conseil scolaire de l'époque, le directeur général de l'époque, et malheureusement, ces négociations ne vont réellement pas donner de bons résultats parce qu'on va nous opposer un certain nombre de choses. La première chose qu'on va nous opposer, c'est que selon l'article 23 de la Charte canadienne des droits et libertés, donne droit aux parents francophones à l'éducation francophone, notamment des parents francophones à l'éducation francophone. Mais nous, on nous disait que bien que nous n'avons pas droit, que l'article 23 n'inclut pas les nouveaux immigrants francophones. Et en conséquence, c'est un privilège qu'on nous fait de nous accepter dans les écoles. Et que par conséquent, on devrait plutôt être reconnaissant au lieu de faire des revendications. Parce que somme toute, c'est un privilège qu'on nous fait de nous accepter dans les écoles francophones. Ça, c'était la première objection qu'on a faite à cette époque-là. Et puis après, on a dit tout ce que j'ai souligné tout à l'heure, que les immigrants qui arrivaient n'étaient vraiment pas capables de pouvoir enseigner en Alberta à cause de leur culture, de leur background culturel, ainsi de suite, ainsi de suite. Alors, nous avons donc, on s'est tout de même battu avec le conseil scolaire de l'époque pour faire avancer un peu les choses. Elles n'ont pas beaucoup avancé à l'époque, mais on a fait quelques recrutements quand même pour la forme, pour présenter quelque chose, mais ça n'avait pas vraiment été, il n'y avait pas eu beaucoup d'avancées. C'est avec la nouvelle administration du conseil scolaire que nous avons véritablement commencé à discuter. On a connu quelques avancées et nous sommes toujours en train de travailler là-dessus ensemble pour pouvoir renforcer cette inclusion et ce multiculturalisme au niveau de la francophonie. En 2016, nous avons lancé un appel pour que l'ORIFA, le réseau d'immigration francophone, soit remis, que la gestion soit remise aux immigrants et que ce ne soit pas géré par un organisme qui n'a aucune expérience vécue de l'immigration. Alors, ça a causé beaucoup de problèmes. On a eu beaucoup de tensions au sein de la francophonie. Je suis sûr que certains d'entre vous le savent. Mais finalement, l'ACFA a accepté cela et cette gestion du RIFA lui a été retirée et on a créé un comité de transition. Donc, ça, c'était des actions que nous avons menées, entre autres actions, et quelque chose de très important. En 2018, nous avons eu une grosse crise au niveau de la francophonie où l'établissement, le centre, l'agence d'accueil de l'époque avait vu ses financements coupés par le gouvernement fédéral et le gouvernement provincial. Alors, nous avons pris des initiatives pour le maintien des financements liés à l'accueil et l'établissement au niveau de la francophonie. Et pourquoi est-ce que nous avons fait ça? C'était une question de multiculturalisme aussi, parce que nous pensions que, en réalité, la plupart des immigrants qui arrivent ici depuis quelques années sont des immigrants subsahariens. Alors, supprimer les financements était en réalité pénaliser ces nouveaux immigrants-là qui arriveraient. Donc, nous nous sommes battus pour que ces financements soient maintenus, afin que quand les immigrants, les nouveaux arrivants arrivent, qu'ils trouvent un contexte dans lequel ils peuvent être accueillis avec une certaine sensibilité culturelle, au lieu que ces fonds-là aillent à un organisme qui n'avait pas cette sensibilité culturelle. Donc ça, nous l'avons fait et nous sommes parvenus à convaincre le gouvernement fédéral qui nous a accordé ce financement, le dernier financement du centre d'accueil à l'époque. Et ensuite, donc, il a fallu sécuriser ces financements pour 5 ans, ce que nous avons réussi à faire en 2020. Et entre-temps, il y a eu de fortes négociations. C'est pour ça que je parle ici en 2018 de négociations tripartites. Il fallait négocier avec le gouvernement provincial, le gouvernement fédéral et les organismes francophones. Alors, tout ça a causé certaines tensions au sein de la francophonie parce qu'une fois de plus, c'est un problème ici d'inclusion et de multiculturalisme. Certaines personnes estimaient que les nouveaux arrivants ou bien les immigrants qui étaient arrivés comme nous nous mêlions de ce qui ne nous concernait pas. Ils estimaient que nous n'avions pas l'expérience, nous n'avions pas la capacité nous n'avions pas du tout les ressources nécessaires pour pouvoir prendre la responsabilité d'accueillir les immigrants francophones chez nous. Mais nous avons pu convaincre le gouvernement fédéral d'y arriver, ce que nous avons fait en 2019 finalement. Alors, pour finir, je dirais qu'actuellement, la FRAP continue à travailler résolument dans le sens de pouvoir assurer ce multiculturalisme et cette intégration. Nous travaillons quand nous accueillons les immigrants, mais nous travaillons aussi dans les écoles et nous travaillons à mettre les communautés ensemble. Nous le faisons pratiquement tous les jours. Nous avons un personnel pour ça. Et je me réjouis simplement de cette occasion qui m'est donnée pour souligner le fait que, honnêtement, ce combat pour le multiculturalisme et l'intégration au niveau des francophones n'est pas fini. Nous avons encore de très gros défis liés au fait que nous devons être acceptés et nous devons être véritablement inclus dans la dynamique générale de la francophonie. Et c'est pour ça que nous menons des discussions actuellement avec l'ACFA, pour que nous puissions arriver à une entente, parce que somme toute, la francophonie, c'est une maison qui a deux chambres. Il y a une chambre de la francophonie traditionnelle, il y a une chambre de la francophonie immigrante. Et je pense que c'est très important que nous puissions nous entendre pour pouvoir construire l'avenir de la francophonie. Merci pour votre attention.
Merci, Alphonse, pour avoir décrit votre perspective. I would now like to welcome Dr. Dwayne Donald to speak to us. Dwayne is a descendant of the Ifeomachinuba, or Beaver Hills people, and the Papa's Chase Cree. He works as a professor in the Faculty of Education, actually in my department, at the University of Alberta. Born and raised in Edmonton, Dwayne's research has focused on engaging educators in a critical genealogical excavation of these colonial terrain, which he does both through his writing and speaking and through practical land-based teaching in the form of walks. Welcome, Dwayne.
Thank you, Olenka, for that very kind introduction. Merci, Alphonse. I listened in French as best I could. It's been a while since I've listened to French. I don't think I understood as much as I was hoping, but I look forward to learning more. Tansein totem tik, niwa magantik, kakio kitatum skatanoao. Nigan ne naska mao momotai mao kse manitu anokaki skakekwa matsuan. Ne naska moneko mina gitwam gisagawi wa pataman. Mstahai maskwa ni tsiga sun. Just wanted to greet you all, and as friends and relatives, which is how we're taught to do that, to address you all in that way, although I haven't met most of you. And I just expressed gratefulness for life and for another day. And I hope you feel the same way this morning. I hope you feel grateful for life and that you feel good. I am happy to be invited to participate in this gathering, this strange gathering that I guess we're kind of getting used to. I'm not sure I want to, though. And myself, based on my experiences and my work, I think this kind of gathering together, not just to talk, but of course to listen, it might be the most important thing that we can do these days. And I think things change significantly when we're in each other's presence physically. So I hope that we can do that. We can continue to speak in these ways. But I guess today we'll do our best. And I want to thank Carrie for what she shared. As I kind of expected, she shared a lot of things that were also on my mind. We've been mentored with similar traditions, and so I'm going to try to, I guess, riff off of some of the great things that she shared and maybe give my own takes in different ways. I think, for me, when I think about multiculturalism as a policy and as someone who studied curriculum, I can tell you that it's been a very successful curriculum project across the country. Over a few generations now, students know multicultural policy, they know the history, they can talk about it, they know the values. But to kind of give I guess, a broad statement that maybe I could say more about in the time to come, what I notice is that multicultural policy has been kind of imposed on us as though there was nothing there in place already to give us guidance on how to live together, and I think, of course, that's around the world. That's a fundamental question that people ask: is how do we live together in a way that supports everybody? And I don't think we're going to solve it necessarily, but what I'm interested in is how do we create conditions where something life-giving and life-sustaining for us all can emerge, and how can we continue to try to support that in that way, and again try to let go of this idea that we have the answer or we have the solution, just to engage with the complexity of these issues. The other thing that I think is really important is for us to think about I guess I'll call it the problem of multiculturalism as connected to many other issues that we face these days. And so to see that interconnectedness and to see them, understand them as related. And certainly one of the things that I guess I've been taught or I've been mentored about is that human relations are directly connected to how we relate to what gives us life. In other words, these two things can't be separated out. And if we want to live together better as human beings, we also have to fix our relationship to the more than human and try to understand ourselves in that way. And so this idea of what might inspire us, if you're kind of interested in what I'm talking about, say what might inspire us in that way, what might give us guidance. And one of the things that I've been deeply influenced by is the important, I think, assertion that wisdom sits in places. And this it's not unique to the place where I'm from or my tradition. Wisdom sits in places all around the world. But the important message there is that human knowledge and human understanding, when it's at its best, is connected to the ecosystem where the people live. We are inspired by the ecosystem. We're guided by the ecosystem. And I'm well aware that kind of talk seems kind of outdated with all the things that we're facing these days. But to pay attention to local sources of inspiration that can give us guidance on how to live together well. And so I'm very interested in my work with how the wisdom that exists in this place where we live can guide us in that way. And within all of that, one thing that we have to acknowledge is that we are surrounded by a logic of placelessness. Our institutions are governed by them. And most of the philosophies that inform how we talk about these things in this language I'm speaking now are governed by a logic of placelessness. So what I mean by that is that there's sort of, since Columbus did what he did, gradually over many centuries, there's then this imposition of a falsely universalized way to be a successful human being that's been imposed on people all around the world. And my view is that multicultural policy is a manifestation of that problem. So what it tells us is that it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter about the local ecosystem. It doesn't matter about the particularities of the wisdom of the place where you're from. We have a solution to all your problems. We have a logic that will answer all your questions. And to me, it's colonial ideology that has morphed into liberal philosophy that continues to recenter itself as the answer to any question we might ask. And this is, in my observation, this is part of the reason that when people talk about Indigenous Canadian relations these days, most often they leave out truth and they want to talk about reconciliation, because reconciliation is actually a concept that comes from liberal philosophy. And in the institution I work at, and maybe you've experienced in your own places, what I've noticed, since the calls to action were issued and the final report was given, is that equity, diversity, and inclusiveness talk has been ramped up as a response to the challenge of truth. And it's displaced most of the conversations that we could have that would be meaningful. And so what are the sources of inspiration? What might we draw upon the local wisdom that exists here? My view is that if we want to fix or be better with human relationality, we have to get ourselves back in right relation with what gives us life. And this is a central teaching of Treaty 6 that is often overlooked, very rarely talked about in public settings, that not only was it a human-to-human agreement, it was also about how to live well with other forms of life that exists here. And how in this kinship kind of understanding, in Nihiawiwan, we call that wahkotuan. It's understanding how you're connected and enmeshed in relationships, and you conduct yourself in a manner that supports the continuation of those relationships in a healthy way. So that's what I mean by how multiculturalism was invented when we already had things in place here that could give us good guidance. Now, I'm not trying to say that, the solution to our struggles is for everybody to convert to, Cree wisdom, just accept it. That's been tried, that whole kind of imposition. It doesn't work very well. But what I am saying is that this is something that together we could try to lift up and try to learn more from. This idea of sacred ecology, this idea of the health of the ecosystem is connected to the health of our human systems, and how we can begin to try to work together, mindful of climate change and other challenges we face, to try to get balance in these. And I'll just finish up just by sharing something that I was taught. And that has to do with that treaty handshake that's depicted on the medal that some of you may have seen when Treaty 6 was negotiated. And so, what I was taught is that you have the Queen's representative, and we have First Nations leader. They're engaged in a handshake. And they say that was an adoption ceremony that took place there. They didn't talk about land surrender or ceding this or giving up that. They talked about adopting each other as relatives. And so with that handshake, they say there are 4 things that are central to understanding the significance of that handshake. And with these concepts that I'm going to share with you, one thing that's important is that in the language, they're understood as in motion and in need of being constantly renewed. In other words, they're not static, they're verbs. So the first one I want to share with you is ka mia wichitoyak. So that has to do with friendship or kinship, and that has to do with getting along well. Ka mia wichitoyak. The next one is ka witasketoyak, which has to do with living in peace. As nations, side by side, living in peace in that way. Kawitaskitoyak, that has to do with, being a good neighbor, sharing, helping, being alongside each other in a supportive, ethical way. And then my favorite is Kaamio Opagitoyak, and that has to do with raising each other's children well. Or taking the chance to teach other people's children and them doing the same for you, which is like the ultimate kind of reciprocity. And so I don't think we need multicultural policy or better multicultural policy. We need to allow ourselves to be guided by the wisdom that's existed here, and then begin to talk to each other about what that means for all of you, your own history, your own stories, your own traditions. And it's from that there's going to be an emergence of a new story for us to live together by. That's what I've been working on. Anyway, hi, that's enough for me for now. Take care, everybody.
Hi. Thank you, Dwayne, for sharing insights on Treaty 6 especially. I would now like to welcome Ifeomachinuba. She is a Nigerian-born poet and novelist. As a child, she experienced the turbulence of the Biafra War and endured the uncertainty of being a refugee. Once able to return to school and graduate, Ifeoma pursued a career in diplomacy, culminating in her appointment as Nigeria's ambassador to Côte d'Ivoire from 2014 to 2017. While in the Foreign Service, she used her spare time to pen 3 novels, 2004's Merchants of Flesh, which won the Prose Prize of the Association of Nigerian Authors, Fearless, and 2008's Waiting for Maria, which was awarded the Association of Nigerian Authors Prose Prize as well. Waiting for Maria was also nominated for the 2008 Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Ifeoma is currently the writer-in-residence for the University of Alberta's Department of English and Film Studies and enjoys exchanging ideas and stories with the diverse people she meets in the city of Edmonton. We are happy to have her share some stories with us today. Welcome, Ifeoma.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alenka. Thank you, Jennifer, Natalia, all the organizers of this symposium. I am honored to be invited to share my perspectives on it, and I must say I have gained a lot already from what I have heard, those who have presented their papers and their ideas. And I think they gel with what I have in mind here. I didn't know their papers, I didn't see it ahead of time, but I can understand where they're coming from. And I think my paper pertains to their attitudes. And eventually during the question and answer session, of course, we shall have exchanges that will go further into some of their ideas. So I'd like to thank the organizers again for inviting my perspective on this reconciling multiculturalism in today's Canada. I must say, I'm a recent immigrant to Canada. I arrived really 2019. 2019, I became a landed immigrant, even though I had been before, but I left, pursued my career in the Foreign Service and then came back. So I'm a recent immigrant to Canada. In my former life, I was a diplomat. And this nomadic career led me to visit over 60 countries worldwide. My children were growing up and we chose Canada as a place to be, to raise them. Donc, imaginez un peu, sur plus de 60 pays que j'ai visités, j'ai visité, choisi le Canada comme pays préféré. Canada is a welcoming country. Its strong institutions function. Life is predictable here. Secure, rule of law, all these institutions are working. And more importantly, Canada's national anthem, there's a refrain, there's a stanza that says, "Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee." So that refrain enjoins us to watch out, to be on the alert, to protect these institutions, to protect this national ethos. Don't take it for granted, because anything could go wrong. So to use the parlance of evangelists and prayer warriors, where Canada is now, is the prayer point of many countries. You know, when people pray, for instance, they say, oh, I want a house, I want a car, I want a good job, I want a good spouse, I want children, la, 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 la. Where Canada is right now is the prayer point of so many other countries. Or at least they are peoples, that's where they want to be. And that's why you see many people rushing this way. Because Canada has what they want, has the ideal, which their own countries cannot provide them. So you have heard it said that the world needs many more Canadas. The world needs so many Canadas to provide what Canada is providing to the world. When my kids were growing up, in the kindergarten nursery, they used to sing a song. When they come home, they'll be singing. Excuse my voice. Good, better, best. I must do my best until my good is better and my better best. In other words, Canada is the #1 place to be in the whole world. Bon, d'après un sondage des lecteurs du journal USA Today, pourtant, à l'intérieur du pays, il reste encore de chemin à parcourir. If Canada is #1 in the whole world, the best place to be, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Following the poem I just recited, good, better, best. I must do my best until my good is better and until my better is best. So Canada has a lot of things to do again to improve inclusivity, to eliminate what they call cancel culture, to eliminate what we call otherizing people. That is when you see another person that doesn't look like you, or yeah, an other, that's an other, that's not here, that's an other, otherizing people. Because reconciliation means making amends. You recognize the wrongs you have done in the past, but now, never again going forward. I think that's what reconciliation means. That, I recognize the past wasn't so good, just made some mistakes, but going forward now, never again. I will not repeat those things I did. Otherwise, there's no reconciliation. There's no point. So, as I said, I have visited so many countries, and I would like now to propose for consideration a policy that has worked in my home country, Nigeria. Because in the search for solutions, we may not need to reinvent the wheel, as people say, but borrow a leaf from other climes. Where we see that this policy has worked there, we can borrow it. This policy has worked there, we can also borrow from there and improve what we have here in Canada. As you know, Nigeria is a multi-ethnic country. Some pundits have gone as far as describing Nigeria as multinationalistic, that we have so many nationalities all in one place, made up of numerous languages, nation states, cultures, tribes, all within that geographical expression called Nigeria. And this, you know, arose, a little bit of history from the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, where Africa was partitioned, carved out like a piece of cake, without regard to the natives, to what was on the ground. With the result that in Lagos State, for instance, in Nigeria, you have homes where the front door, when you go out the front door, you are in Benin Republic, Republic of Benin. And when you go out through the back door, you are in Nigeria. That was how arbitrary it was. Because it was in Berlin, they were carving the Africa out without saying, who are you, what are your cultures, can you mix with your name? No, nothing like that. So it was arbitrary. That's what we have in Nigeria now. So apart from that, apart from this arbitrary division, think of the civil war we also had. From 1967 to 1970, we had the Nigeria Biafra civil war. Yes, I was a refugee, that war. So I fled, but that's another matter altogether. So in Nigeria, there are so many cleavages, so many divisions along tribe, we have over 300 tribes, 300 languages, and still counting. There are so many. So, because Canada is almost like Nigeria, with disparate peoples, people from different historical, cultural positionings. As Alphonse said, people are coming from sub-Saharan Africa, people are coming from all over the world, different cultures, different everything, but they are coming here. And how can you come to Canada and become a Canadian? That is the challenge. So in order to foster integration and cohesion among these disparate demographics in Nigeria, we instituted what they call the National Youth Service Corps Scheme. How does it work? Basically, it is an immersion policy. Young graduates are posted to parts of Nigeria different from their comfort zone, different from where they were raised, different from where they studied. They are sent to rural areas and underserved areas for 1 year of service to the fatherland. This period, inevitably, they encounter the cultures of their place of assignment. Maybe they've never been there before. Maybe they are born in Toronto and then you want to join government service. Okay, well, you need to do 1 year service in Nunavut or in any part different from your comfort zone, different from your language, different from what you grew up with. So when you encounter these cultures in these new places, you understand better the ways of life of other Canadians. Inevitably, you make friends, foster understanding, you close gaps, and then you appreciate the challenges these locals face. At the end of your service period, greater empathy is born. Cancel culture is reduced. Organizing fellow Confederates diminishes because the feeling of I've been there, I have worn their shoes, I know how they feel, I know what they're going through, I know the challenges they face in that place. This national service is a sine qua non for employment in government in Nigeria, and also in the private sector now. They are requiring that before they employ somebody, you must have show your certificate that you have given 1 year of your service to the country, and that you have gone to another part of Nigeria to appreciate the people, the challenges they face, their morals, their cultures, their way of life. So I think that Canada can consider instituting this policy, tweaking it here and there, if need be, to get our youngsters mixing with other Canadians that don't look like them, that are not like them, and to create greater national coherence going forward. Because there's a lot of baggage. Our generation and past generations, we have a lot of baggage. And inevitably, we carry them. We listen to our parents, we listen to discussions, and we imbibe these things, these prejudices. So we can now depend on the youth, on the young people coming up to educate them. But that where we have failed, where we are making demands and not budging, they can go around the whole country. You see somebody who's been born in Edmonton, he remains in Edmonton, he studies in Edmonton, he goes to school in Edmonton, he's working in Edmonton. How is he going to appreciate what happens in Yellowknife or another place, in Halifax? So I think this is what I'm bringing to the table. That I come from a multi-ethnic, not multiracial. Almost everyone in Nigeria is Black, but multi-ethnic, multi-tribal. And that these cleavages that we have, I see them here in Canada. And that this is one of the ways Nigeria has tried to absorb those shocks, to make the society a bit more coherent, a bit more understanding. Because invariably too, when you post somebody, a young person, to another area, at that age, is likely to even marry and even establish there, and then knit together a Canada that is more, of course, multiracial, of course, but at least thinking in one direction and understanding the fellow Confederates. So this is what I have to say, and I thank you again. Je vous remercie pour cette invitation qui me permet de dire mes idées sur le sujet. Merci beaucoup and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ifeoma, for sharing some of your insights and experiences and offering some proposals for the future. I'd now like to welcome Maria Angelica Casey. Maria Angelica is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights. She holds a BA in Sociology from Universidad Nacional de Colombia, a BA double major in Anthropology and Political Science, and an MA in Political Science from the University of Alberta. She is passionate to contribute to social and environmental justice and was the co-creator of the Settlement Studies Diploma at Northwest College, where she taught, designed curriculum, and led research for almost 5 years. To share her perspectives, I am pleased to welcome Angelica Casey.
Thank you so much, Olenka, and thank you to all the previous speakers. As Ifeoma mentioned, it's hard to be presenting at the end and not thinking about all the things that have been said and ruminating in my brain and bringing new ideas. So with that, just a full disclosure, I'm at home and I have my 3-year-old with me. So you might hear her, you might see her. And that's one of the perks of working from home. My husband had an emergency at work and he had to leave. So we will work with what we have and hopefully we'll make it through the 15 minutes. And so I want to start by thanking you all and thank you for the organizers and allowing me to address a national audience on such a relevant and current topic, multiculturalism and the relation with reconciliation. And I want to start my presentation by grounding myself in 3 important things that will allow me to wave my presentation. So the first one is that all the reflections and experience about both multiculturalism and reconciliation have been created, inspired, and learned in Amaskochiwaskaigan, which is the place where I lived for 20 years. And we know as Edmonton as well. I'm really grateful to the land. I'm really grateful to the people and the relationships that I created for those 20 years. And I'm inspired by all I did there. I recently moved, about 2 months ago, I moved to Treaty 1 territory. And I'm really eager to, that hopefully COVID and the winter will allow me in the next few months to go out and start building those relationships, because there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of things that I want to start building here. And I always want to make myself useful to the land, to bring and to help build, more than bring, is more like help build and understand and learn how environmental and social justice should look like here and how do I contribute to that. The second thing is that I bring the perspective of a practitioner. And so, yes, I'm a the director of research and evaluation, but I'm looking at research and evaluation from the perspective of how knowledge and what knowledge has to be created and collected to support the programming that we do, to support the communities that we work with, to identify gaps. And so it's a really practical research that I'm really proud of, and that in a way took me out of university, because I stopped my PhD because I was really embedded in working as a researcher at the JHC. So I'm really proud of what I do, and I want to share with you part of that. And the third thing is that I'm going to be talking about multiculturalism and reconciliation in parallel, and mention a little bit, I think that as most people have done today in the panel, about my story of immigration in Canada. Not because I think that my story is really special and unique, and but rather because I can evoke really common places and really common experiences of immigrants, and primarily the experience of immigration for brown women coming from South America, from the global South, with audible and distinguishable accent when speaking English, which makes my experience really relatable to many in the country, but that allow me to also argue that the experience of settlement is not homogeneous. The experience of multiculturalism, the experience of immigration is not homogeneous. And for some of us, and I think that Alphonse was really clear of that in his presentation, is that we have a house with different rooms. And many of us belong to those rooms that have doors that are closed. So with those 3 points on the table, I want to, basically what I want to argue is that currently in Canada, we face, as a common thing, a violation of human rights, or people being discriminated because of their gender, their race, their ethnicity, either their ethnic background, and their immigration status. And the multiculturalism policy and the reconciliation talk, I want to call it a talk, an idea that is emerging, are those aspirational conversations, those that are put in policy, become only romantic or aspirational if we do not create mechanisms that, one, protect people to engage with that, and that remediate remediate problems, or remediate situations that when violations of rights happen, when the policy is not fulfilled. So if we don't have remediation mechanisms and tools, if we don't have protections for people to engage with that, then we don't have rights. And that's where we start. And I have to start by mixing that, the lack of mechanisms and the lack of tools and the lack of participation on the policy of multiculturalism, with an almost intentional silence about what people call the difficult past and present of Canada, or the colonial project, the settlement project, the colonial settlement project in Canada. So when an immigrant come to Canada, the last thing we heard, and it still, I came 20 years ago, I hear people that came 20 years before me, and I hear people that come today to Canada, and they do not know about the reality, the history, and the present of the genocidal project in Canada with Indigenous people. So that silence that seems to be in a way intentional, intentionally created by the immigration process and the settlement process, validates a system that allow us, immigrants and Canadians, to continue using immigration to settle the lands of Indigenous peoples to build white capitalism. So that is something that, in spite of a multiculturalism policy, and in spite of the talk of reconciliation, we can create, the immigration process keeps creating a hierarchy in our society, and a hierarchy that allows some of us to have rooms with many doors and room of us with no doors at all. So, and as part of a human rights organization, what we see, what we document, and what we hear and witness in terms of violation of human rights and violations to the policy of multiculturalism is outrageous. And so that is what I want to share with you today. So when we think about the idea of multicultural Canada, I think the first feeling that we had, or the first memory that I had about that multiculturalism idea, is when I immigrated to Canada. So there's always that romantic idea of immigration, the international recognition of Canada as a multicultural, welcoming, diverse country where people can be prosperous and so on and so forth, which partially it's better than the States, and we remain there, we're better than the States. And yes, we might, but that doesn't mean that after a few years at university and 4 years as a program coordinator at a settlement serving agency, I was awoken to the reality that the aspirational equality, equal rights, equal opportunities and equal before the law that are in the preamble of the multiculturalism policy is not a reality. And let me give you some examples, and most of my examples are related to the immigration process, because that's where I want to ground ourselves. And so in a country with a multiculturalism policy that is based on those equalities, equal opportunity, equal rights, equal before the law, it is interesting to question and to continue to see how we allow the private companies to bring and to have a strong participation in the bringing of immigrants, temporary foreign workers, to work in our country without even demanding from them. Just give me a second. Without even demanding from them, from those companies, to connect these workers with organizations that allow them to settle, allow them to integrate, and allow them to bring justice, allow them to complain if there is a violation of human rights or a violation of their rights. So we're bringing people with no families, no connections, no social relationships in Canada to work in places where they don't know their rights, but we're okay with that. And the violation of rights continue to happen in these places, but we don't give people the tools, and we don't mandate private companies to have those obligations with their workers. I was recently also made aware that international trained doctors and nurses, we know that they exist, we know that they come. The government of Canada keeps promoting immigration for those people who had that kind of training. And there is a federal process that allow them, and we have a federal, I'm sorry. You have to wait, okay? I will try to bring it in one part, but you have to be patient. Sorry. Okay, I will fix it. And so we will, these international trained doctors, we have a federal process for them for their credentials to be recognized. And one of the hardest things you have to hear when you come to Canada is your credentials are not valid here. And what that means is no one is going to hire you with the credentials you bring. Your education, your effort, your money is not valid here. So you have to start from zero. However, for workers in some professionals like doctors, they have a federal process that they go through, and it takes about 4 to 5 years for them to write exams. They're expensive exams, and they pass. And when they go to work in the province of Alberta, they reach a ceiling that they can't pass. They can go farther in their careers because as international trained doctors, they have to go to, it's like a kind of an internship. I forgot the word right now, but the spaces for those internships yearly are so little. And they're competed with students, and just a few of them, not even 1 or 2 yearly get that training. And so they reach that level, even though the experience and the training is the same. They get less money and less recognition, and the lack of advancement for them in their careers. And so where is the equal opportunity? Where is the equal rights? But primarily, what is the remediation process that they can go to when that happens? So when we working with JHC, we have questioned ourselves, like, how do we move within this context? So how do we address multiculturalism, diversity, but also the need for remediation and justice? And so we have a framework that allows us to think through this. And so the first one is something that was created by during the creation of the Conventions of the Rights of the Child, and the UN call it the 3 Ps: protection, provision, participation, and that integrates. People needs to be, what it means is protection. People needs to be protected from the violation of human rights that others can have on them. In this case, children. Provision, all the children need to be provided with the basic necessities of life. And participation is children need to have the right to participate in their decisions that affect their own lives. And that is basic. So we extend that to all the programming and all the things we do. And we included an art, which is remediation, which is fundamental. And I have been emphasizing throughout my conversation today, which is if there is no way to remediate when my rights have been violated, I don't have rights, period. I need to have tools and mechanisms and support to engage with those remediation mechanisms. Otherwise, there is no guarantee for rights. There are no rights. And the documents like the multiculturalism policy become aspirational and become a document that is not applicable. And it talks about reconciliation, becomes stuck and ideological hopes, but that's it. So we need to go deeper into that. And the other thing we do is we center around the most marginalized communities. And so that's why one of the things that we do a lot is research, because in every space we are, we want to hear and see how do we center our programming around the people that have less access to rights. And in these cases, it's usually Indigenous people. So when we go to schools, when we go to anywhere we center around the people and build systems and structures and processes that allow them to that address their needs, and in addressing those needs, everyone's needs are addressed. So we recently had a couple of we contracted a research, and I'm really sorry that the noise around me doesn't let me remember the name of the researchers, but the research was about how to reinforce mechanisms for remediation. For example, and we center on the Commission for Human Rights in the federal level, which is one of the main places where people go when their rights have been violated. And we have realized that the barriers for engaging with those mechanisms reside primarily in five things where I'm gonna end. The first one is the lack of awareness of human rights complaint mechanisms among people. So there is no people that do not know how to engage with this. They don't know that they exist. The second one is the lack of guidance and research to draft complaints. We continue to have a system that put the honors of demonstrating human rights violations on the person whose rights have been violated. They not only carry the trauma, the consequences, but also the honors of demonstrating that the right was violated. And yes, that has to be a demonstration, but they need support and resources. There are a lot of technicalities in the process that, like such a word limit and languages that needs to be removed so people can engage. There is the process is long. It takes over 5 years to process the human rights, to go to the process. And there is a lack of capacity for the Human Rights Commission to enforce their decisions. So if there is no remediation, if there is no participation, if the people who are engaged in the system, if the people who are having and suffering the violation of human rights and that have been more marginalized do not have a voice in how to engage with these processes, then it's not going to be, the tools and the mechanisms are not going to be enough. And I will end there.
Thank you, Angelica. Thank you for really sharing some very deep insights, but also for making this kind of multi-generational and musical presentation. As someone in the chat wrote, it's important that all generations are at this table because we are discussing things for all of our futures. Thank you. I am now very pleased to be able to introduce the presenters of the final presentation. We call this our dynamic duo. Here on behalf of Indigenous Ukrainian Relationship Building Initiative. Larissa Hajduk is the director of the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at MacEwan University. Originally from central Ukraine, Larissa is passionate about innovative approaches to connecting people with diverse backgrounds in meaningful and respectful ways. Mutuality, relationship building, and compassion are at the heart of all local and international research and community engaged projects in which Larissa is involved. Joining Larissa is Marina Chernevska. Marina is the archivist at the Cool Folklore Center at the University of Alberta, and she originally hails from Bukovina, Ukraine. Marina holds a Master of Arts in Folklore and a Mastery of Library and Information Studies. Her research interests include orthodox archival practices, traditional knowledge and cultural heritage, especially in community and research archives, and Indigenous memory-keeping traditions and diaspora cultures and identities. Welcome to you both, Larissa and Marina.
Thank you so much, Alenka. Thank you. We are honored to be here today and learn from our co-speakers. It has been wonderful. And Dwayne, I cannot see you, but thank you for a warm welcome. I found myself thinking, how does it feel to be welcome on this land? So I'm going to share the presentation right now, and we will start. We would like to start with an acknowledgement that Marina and I are joining today from Ifeomachinuba Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of Métis Nation, where we live and learn. We are both originally from Ukraine and settled on this land. We are pleased to share the experiences of the first year of the Indigenous Ukrainian Relationship Building Initiative. It is a joint endeavor between Cool Folklore Center at the University of Alberta that Marina represents, and the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at McEwan University, where I work. We launched the initiative a year ago in January 2021. It is, however, important to recognize that we are building our work on several prior efforts, and we would like to highlight a couple of them, two of them. The first, Zemlya na nas common, a ceremonial exchange of gifts, which took place in 2012. The event was co-hosted by Mirna Kostas, an acclaimed writer of literary and creative nonfiction, and now member of our team, and Sharon Pasula, at that time Vice President of the Métis Regional Council in Edmonton. In Mirna's words, deploying Ukrainian and Cree was meant to symbolically bring Aboriginal and Ukrainian Edmontonians back into a relationship, or at least to remind our people that there had been once a relationship. In 2019, as part of the interdisciplinary dialogue Spirit via Dialogues, the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center and Kichiwatsin Indigenous Center at McEwan University organized a very special event called Exploring Indigenous Ukrainian Relations. We started with making, cooking, and eating borscht and bannock, followed by a panel discussion. Terry Sandins, director of Kichiwatsin, and Elder Francis Whiskey Jack made bannock. Associate Dean of Arts and Science, Dr. Obizmira made borscht, and we all assisted in washing, cutting, and most importantly, of course, eating. It was in this shared space that Marina and I knew it was only the beginning. We met with Marina and then with Mirna Kostas to brainstorm, to think and rethink of what was it that we wanted to do. In January 2021, Chelsea Vowell and Biafra joined the initiative. Chelsea is a Métis public intellectual writer, an educator whose work intersects language, gender, Métis determination, and resurgence. Biafra, Ukrainian, Canadian, and doctoral student at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, who has been conducting research with stories of these lands, recovering Indigenous Ukrainian narratives in East Central Alberta. We decided to start our work by engaging the Ukrainian community. We thought it was important to offer a safe space where we all could learn, discuss difficult topics, yet be respectful and compassionate. So this is our small yet mighty founding team.
The goal we identified for this initiative is to advance the knowledge about, to explore and reflect on our Ukrainian-Canadian history and our shared Ukrainian Indigenous past in order to build a better future together for the well-being of all. And at the heart of this initiative, as is clear from its name, is relationship building. We were very mindful of the terminology we used when selecting a name for this initiative. For instance, it was important for us to name it an initiative and not a project that has a start and end. How can one build a relationship and plan to have an identified end to them? Not that we didn't care about specific and measurable objectives, but for us, it was, and still is, more important how we do than what we do. We know that the process of building relationships can be rushed, that it may be challenging, we may feel uncomfortable. In fact, we think it's extremely important to feel uncomfortable if we truly aim for transformation. We believe trust is a necessary component of respectful relationships and understand that it takes time to build such relationships. As Ukrainian Canadians, we acknowledge that voluntarily or involuntarily, our ancestors became part of the colonial project, and with time came to benefit from white privilege. We acknowledge numerous atrocities, injustices, and sufferings that Indigenous peoples in Canada endured and continue to suffer from systemic racism today. We also acknowledge the difficulties and discrimination that early Ukrainian settlers in Canada had to experience. We hope that many past and current injustices can be reconciled with better understanding of the past, acceptance of cultural differences and similarities. We recognize that each of us has gifts to share, and we approach this work with respect, openness, kindness, patience, and humor. So during the first year of the initiative, as Larissa already mentioned, we launched it in January of last year with Leah Hertzum's presentation entitled Recovering Indigenous Ukrainian Narratives in East Central Alberta. We received overwhelming response. This event attracted over 500 registrations. We continued the initiative with another meeting and invited two artists, David Garnou and Sandra Semchuk, to talk about art collaborations as creative care. Then we decided to focus on this theme that is difficult, contested, and extremely important for Indigenous ways and in Ukrainian traditional culture as well, although in different ways, land and land-based practices and relationships. With deep appreciation of how important and political it is, we created a series of talks named Ask You, Zemlya, the land. The first event within this series looked at the history a long time ago and at what Indigenous land-based practices and relationship existed here on this land before Ukrainian settlers immigrated to the prairies, and also at Ukrainian land-based practices and relationship in the Ukrainian homeland. I wish we had time to name and honor each of our speakers, and thankfully their names are available on our website. The second event looked at our recent past, at experiences of Indigenous peoples and Ukrainian settlers within a prairie-specific context during the 20th century, and how these experiences influenced land-based practices and relationships. And for the third event, we tried to take what we've learned about our remote and recent pasts and imagine the future that we want our descendants to live in, and interventions that Indigenous peoples and Ukrainian settlers can make today for such future to happen. During 2021, we also had the pleasure to work with Sharon Rose Kutney, a Métis Cree artist with Ukrainian ancestry, who created a beautiful logo for our initiative, and you can see it on each slide of our presentation today. I would like to quote from the artist's statement. The flowers of the logo represent fortitude, hope, and faith, and the cycles and passages of my grandmother's life. The berries signify their commonalities, their kindness and generosity of spirit, and their steadfast perseverance, achieved with an open and welcoming heart. We also created a website as a place to access recordings of our previous events. All of them are available online. Provide general information about the initiative, and to start compiling a list of resources on the topic of Indigenous Ukrainian relationships.
So what are the lessons after year one? The lessons are many, but by the end of year one, we have more questions than answers, and Marina will talk more about it later. The urgency to explore the history of Indigenous Ukrainian relations, past and present, good and bad, has been recognized by many. There has been overwhelming interest in our initiative from the Ukrainian community, and we are very grateful. Keeping the Ukrainian community engaged is critical. The importance of creating safe spaces for honest, kind conversations cannot be overestimated. And this is what we are aiming to do with this initiative. And for those conversations, must be built on trust, mutuality, and reciprocity. Relationality is at the heart of our approach. We strive to build relationships with kindness and respect. Relationships come as a result of respectful, reciprocal collaborations. It is the way we do this work that matters. Relationships are never complete. They require ongoing negotiations. While online events can be convenient to access, providing you have internet, and reach people who wouldn't be able to be present in person otherwise, they are very difficult to build relationships. Through research, speaker panels, discussions, providing resources on our website, we attempt to uncover the truths, reach our community, encourage our people to reflect more, to sit with that uncertainty and maybe even pain, and to stay in that uncomfortable place for a while. We have to recognize that willingly or unwillingly, we all benefited and continue to benefit from the displacement and colonization of Indigenous peoples. We have to recognize that structural barriers exist. We have to recognize that racism exists, and it is up to us to address it. To mend relationships requires steps to address injustices. Our past informs our present and our future. There is no doubt that Indigenous and Ukrainian people have shared stories, but we need to tell them. We have to redress Indigenous erasure in Ukrainian settler narratives. These stories must become part of the Ukrainian-Canadian histories. We recognize the complexities and tensions of this work. And we do have hope for a better future together. Our young generation also gives us hope. They're introducing new programs, define strategic directions of their organizations, focusing on reconciliation. Year one of the initiative engaged so many people, pushed so many boundaries, made us reflect and rethink again. Facing inconvenient truths requires courage. It hurts, it is uncomfortable, but we are strong. Our values are deep, and I trust we can do it together.
So a few words about what's next. As much as we want and need to meet in person, it looks like we'll have to continue with online events for the foreseeable future. However, we are planning an in-person land-based small event at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village and Métis Crossing this summer, which in a way will be a continuation of our land series, but also as a way to plan our future work. We will continue growing our resources pages, and we're also working on a technical solution to provide opportunity for people to share stories, their personal or family stories of Indigenous Ukrainian interactions. We noticed within our audiences the need to share these. However, most importantly, we keep learning and unlearning. And as Larissa mentioned, we now have more questions than a year ago. We try to be constantly self-reflective and question our assumptions. Thinking about relationships, we're thinking, why should Indigenous people be interested in investing their time and efforts in building relationships with yet another group of settlers? How can we inspire Ukrainian Canadians to learn more about Indigenous past? How can we create space for different kinds of stories to be told? Not only sweet, nice stories of help and rescue that we hear often in connection with the history of Ukrainian settlement here in the prairies, but also difficult stories of pain and discrimination, of complicity and racism. How can we ensure that we face our own complicity with courage to transform? What are our Ukrainian Canadians' responsibilities in the process of building relationships? Can we imagine a future where Ukrainian Canadians stand together with Indigenous people as allies for the better future of all? I'd like to end with one more question borrowed from the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, one of their compass questions. How can we start to heal our individual and collective pain without guilt, paralysis, self-righteousness, entitlement, depoliticization, wound attachment, transference, tantrums, rewounding, and drama? We don't have answers to these questions, but we do acknowledge the complexity of these issues and are ready to walk our journey, to pay our respects, and do our part in this work of building relationships. Perhaps without knowing our destination, but rather living responsibly this process, focusing on relationships.
And we would like to finish our presentation by thanking again all the speakers of all our events and all people who attended, who were with us in that space. Thank you so much, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Larissa and Marina, for sharing glimpses of a multi-year journey that you've been on. As I think we've seen with all the speakers, time plays a very important role in all of our journeys and in reconciliation. Marina, I'd like to apologize. I think when I introduced you, I said orthodox archival practices, and I did mean to say unorthodox archival practices. Apologies. So we have come to the time to open the floor to questions. But just before we do, and as you are taking a moment to reflect and compose those questions, I'd like to acknowledge the generous funding this symposium has received from Heritage Canada and the Community Support, from Heritage Canada and the Community Support, Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism Initiatives Program. We are gratified that the vision for reconciling multiculturalism in today's Canada was recognized and appreciated by Heritage Canada, and we are grateful for the support of this work. Now, on to the discussion. To review, if you wish to pose a question during this discussion portion, you have two options. Type your question using the chat feature. You can access this by clicking the chat button in the meeting controls. Make sure that you are addressing your question to everyone and that it is not a private message. Or you may ask a question using your computer's audio inputs, in which case you would use the raise hand function and wait to be called upon. If you are called upon, you will be asked to confirm your camera is turned on and that you are unmuted. When asking your questions, please be as brief and respectful as possible. Because of time constraints, it's possible that all questions may not receive answers. We now welcome all roundtable participants to share their experiences and knowledges with our audience in response to questions or comments. Natalia, please.
I just wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity for me and others to share and hear rather such a diversity of perspectives. More particularly, I'm also appreciative of those opinions and recommendations which you were all forwarding today with respect to what is next. I don't have a particular question, but I wanted to just to reflect on the fact that I have learned a lot today, and I'm especially now looking forward to learning more about the pre-existing protocols and practices when it comes to good living, as have been practiced amongst the Indigenous communities. So thank you for that. I think a couple of our presenters were focusing on that, and Ifeoma and Alfonso and Angelica. It's great also to hear the perspectives which may have been shaped both by your experiences elsewhere. I'm actually very curious about panelists maybe reflecting on each other's presentations, to be honest, than me asking you a question. This is my way of maybe breaking the ice for this and not asking the question, but expressing my appreciation for all of you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. I noticed there's a question from Nancy Crusette, and it's aimed at Dwayne Donald. Dwayne, your wisdom is admired, and Nancy and I'm sure others really liked your presentation. Might you be able to share in the chat some titles of your written work and perhaps indicate where that might be able to be found? I'm not sure, maybe you have some things on your website that you could also share the link for.
Thanks, Nancy, for your interest. And I don't have a website really that's up to date. I'm kind of, I don't have social media either, but what I can do is I'll look for a few titles that I can post in the chat. So I'll do that right now.
Thanks, Dwayne. And I see Oliver has his hand up. Oliver Roste, please.
And thank you so much for these amazing presentations. I think it's such a gift to have your conversation flow both to each other and across the University of Alberta various platforms. I've been enjoying watching the recordings. I have to pop in and out of these sorts of things, so I really appreciate the fact that you've been able to pull this together at all and then make it so accessible. So my question is essentially a request for help. I know I respect that I come from a place of privilege. I'm a white male. I have, various learning opportunities in my career. But right now I'm actually in the midst of organizing an anti-racism initiative connected to an amazing scholar named Dr. Gordon Hirabayashi. And a phrase that came up in the presentations today, and a phrase that I've been hearing more recently is nothing about us without us. And what I would ask of you, amazing participants on this panel, how can so I'm a bureaucrat, right? I organize research teams. How can or what are some thoughts you would give advice to people like me who want to help create a safe space for anti-racism dialogues or, inclusivity dialogues? What advice would you give to people like me in terms of how we can create spaces like this?
Thank you for the question, Oliver. I think that's a question that any one of our presenters might respond to. Would anyone like to initiate that?
I can jump in because it was in my presentation, I used that phrase. So I guess, yeah, so I'm at a post-secondary as well. I'm at Northwest. And the nothing about us without us is really about, and I don't think it's specific to Indigenous people, but I guess the way that I always try and think about it is if I'm creating anything that could have a potential impact on any marginalized group, whether that's Black, queer, poor people, disabled people, whatever it is, like if there's anything that's going to be impacted by, they're going to be impacted by it, then I want to have them at the conversation from the very get-go. So it's really about inviting in all of these perspectives to just make sure that whatever you're building is from the very ground all the way up built with these perspectives, as opposed to pulling them in these consultation roles after the fact, when there's already been things that have been built, when there's already been conversations that have been had. So starting right from the very, very beginning. So you have an idea, pull these people in, pull them in, ask them, you know, likely they all already have things developed and ideas that they would like to see within the institution. So it stops the sort of like assumption that we know what these communities need. And it, you know, it really amplifies the really important work of these that's really specific to these communities. That's how I try and understand it.
Thank you, Carrie. Anyone else?
I will jump in as well on that. I think that one of the things that I wanted to highlight, Oliver, today in the presentation is the fact that any community, even if we describe them as marginalized, they're not homogeneous. We are not homogeneous. And please, it is important to allow the space for us to disagree with each other in respectful ways as well, because it's part of it. Disagreement is allowed in mainstream society, but when we talk about minorities, we think that we should be homogeneous, period. And that if each one of us carry the responsibility to talk on behalf of the whole community, which is a heavy weight to carry. And so creating strategies to understand and allow the diversity in respectful ways to flourish is amazing, because that also helps us build together. The other thing is, like, we have been hearing lately trauma-informed practice, and we are moving more into a healing-centered practice, where even the person who is holding the space recognize the trauma that we all carry, and that we need to sit together to heal together. Because the fact that I recognize myself as a settler in this land, and the trauma that has caused me, but the trauma that I have caused others through my actions, is really, really important in terms of like healing together and recognizing what we need as a community, and even among diverse communities, that is important. And I guess nothing about us without us starts by asking the community, how do you want to be engaged? From the beginning, I agree with Carrie. It's like from the get-go, but how do you want to be engaged? How do you see yourself? And what is the fair practice, but also the fair recognition of your time and your experience? Because sharing that and engaging, it takes a toll on communities. And I've seen it in many communities where the sharing of the experience is taken for granted. And that is almost an obligation if you want to participate, if you want to be taken into account. So with marginalized communities, we need to make sure that we think about recognizing that experience in ways that is fair for them, or for us.
Thank you. Alphonse?
Yes, I just want to, I have one advice for Oliver. I think the first thing to do is to resist the temptation of speaking on behalf of these groups. Because this is what happens usually when you want to do something, you feel like you need to go there and speak out about it. But I think it's not the right way to do that. The right way to do that is to let people that are marginalized to speak for themselves, and to do your best to empower them so that they can do that in a way that, because I agree, I know that it's not always easy to people that are marginalized to speak out. But how do we empower them so that they can speak for themselves? I think that will be the best, because as soon as they start speaking for themselves, it's done. You don't necessarily anymore. They can keep on and they can keep defending their own rights. So that's what I will advise. Thank you.
Merci. Marina.
Thank you. I would like to build on what Angelica and Alphonse said, and provide a quote that I learned from Diane Conrad, a professor of arts-based research here. It's a quote from Leela Watson, an Indigenous Australian visual artist and activist. And it goes like this: if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think it's also important to remember that we can't really help, and maybe our help is not really needed. We have our work to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Larissa.
I would like to highlight the importance of building trust, developing trust. You cannot do this work just for the sake of doing, because it is now it is good to do it. And it takes work. It takes very hard work, but it is very, very rewarding. I can talk about the interdisciplinary dialogue that we have been running at McEwan. And in year 2, we introduced the topic of gender reconciliation was there. And by the way, we worked with Dwayne not once. Thank you for that. So we a group of us, faculty members at McEwan University, came together. None of us Indigenous, and we wanted to do the interdisciplinary dialogue. We reached out to Ifeomachinuba Indigenous Center because we knew, as you say, we cannot do this work without them. We invited them, and at that time, Terry Sanjins and Roxanne Tutusis were no longer with us. They came, but I have to say, it took us months for Terry and Roxanne to trust us, for Terry to see that we mean it, that we mean this work. And from that one project that everybody was involved, engaged, so many other initiatives blossom. And I will stop there, but building trust is, it is hard work, rewarding work, and you cannot move. And people see through you, right? Whether you mean it or not.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to a question from Diane Campo, who wrote, I want to refer to the two canoes metaphor. French-Canadian voyageurs were used in the past to paddle side by side with Indigenous people. Do you think we may also rebuild that relationship that existed before? I think that's maybe directed at Carrie or Dwayne.
Yeah, I guess my thought is that I don't want to necessarily romanticize the idea that settler and Indigenous relations were something different before. I know that is a large part of the, the colonial narrative, and I'm not saying that there was no good relations, but I think that this has been a long-standing relationship. I think that the ways that Canada has interacted with Indigenous peoples has been largely the same throughout history and continues into today. So I'm not sure that I would think about a relationship in the past being symbolic of something that we can return to. I don't know that I'm convinced that there ever was a point in time that we were in right relations with not just our communities, but with the other than human relatives as well. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say about that.
Thanks. Dwayne, would you like to add to that?
Thank you.
No, I think Carrie said it all.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Jane Hurley, who writes, without a multicultural policy, would Canada become more assimilationistic? I thought the essence of multicultural policy was to try and instill respect for many different cultural ways of knowing and being. Yet it has been described at this conference as genocidal, part of the colonial project. What could stand in its place? Dwayne, you suggested that the current policy doesn't work, but I worry that without it, what would rush to fill the gap?
Treaty.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit, please?
Well, I just encourage you to try to get past the very surface understandings of that treaty relationship as a business deal, as a contract, and try to take the opportunity to just learn across the country the different understandings that have survived all this change and this violence, and what that vision actually was for how we would live together, or how we could live together. And that includes all of us, by the way. So that's where I look for. And part of the real struggle I have is that, as I said a little earlier, is that I think that the central problem we face across many different sectors is that our cultural assumptions are so heavily imbued with liberal philosophy that most of us can't imagine another way to live or another way to be a human being. And this is a major problem that we face if we try to begin to live differently, which we know we're going to have to do. The way we're living isn't sustainable. So where are we going to look for sources of inspiration? I just think that the liberal tradition is not going to help. And so we need to look elsewhere. And that's why I think treaty is so important.
Thank you. I noticed that Yars has added a comment that said, Jane makes a very good point, and Diane is right to draw attention to Carrie's excellent two canoes analogy, as it offers a way forward for a dialogue between multicultural communities and truth and reconciliation. I see that Jen has a question for Alphonse. How have you noted your clients understand and learn about Canada, its broad identity and its history, when typically coming from backgrounds as both visible and linguistic minorities? Quebec has approached multiculturalism in a very different way than other parts of the country, more focused on interculturalism. Do you see this influencing Francophones in Edmonton?
Yes, we have said a lot about multiculturalism, but we didn't talk that much about interculturalism. I think we're trying to take in account to talk about all of that with our clients. But I think the best thing to do, because we're not discussing with clients about concepts, but what we're discussing about that, mostly it's about meeting other cultures and mingling with other communities in Canada. So we have a session here at Biafra where we put different communities together. We call it, for instance, in French, Journée d'accueil des nouveaux arrivants or Journée interculturelle. So we have, for instance, in tomorrow, we'll have the community Canadian from Haiti will come together with other community here in Edmonton, other Francophone community. But we will highlight the high Asian culture. So that's what we do. And that's how we help other community know about, for instance, in this case, about Haiti. And what are their values, what are doing, and how are they coping here in Canada? How is it going for themselves? So we do this type of things. We do that also with Canadian. So, for instance, when we do when we have the some of the holidays in Canada, we'll have Canadian meeting newcomers and explaining them why they do this, why we have this holiday or that holiday here in Canada. So there is a way that we do community connection within LAFRA. And that's how we really translate this concept of multiculturalism and all what is around that. We translate it in what we call community connection. And we do those community connection, and so far, I think that's the best thing that we can do to help immigrants connect with their new communities. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to pose a question then. In Angelica's presentation, she mentioned that in order to really have human rights, there was a need for system, structure, and processes for all peoples. So thinking ahead now to how we can all collectively move ahead, and today we've heard from a number of minority groups, but there are many more. And when I say minority, I'm talking about in numbers, not just in status. And I'm wondering what the future holds.
I'll take that one. A first stab on that. What the future holds. I think that what is hopefully the future holding for us is this having this kind of conversations first, where we can actually see each other in the eye and say, this is how the experience. So the experiences and in Canada and the experiences, and this is why I'm here. There's a lot of assumptions and a lot of misunderstandings among ourselves, among immigrants and among immigrants and Indigenous peoples. Like there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of assumptions that permeate our relationships, and so hopefully there are more and more places where we can sit and have healthy conversations and heal together. To influence policy and influence the future of Canada, and learn to live, imagine a lot of imagination. I can stop thinking about what Carrie says. I mean, the imagining new ways of being, the imagining new ways of relating to each other is fundamental. We don't have that point of reference, but there is a lot of instinct, I will call it, and a lot of learning that we can do from each other. So hopefully that and being able to, from those relationships building, we can influence the place where we want to live, and create those systems and that processes that can work for all of us, making sure that always we center around the people who need it the most. And gathering the experience of the land, I think, grounding there.
Thanks. Srilata, please.
Thank you, Olenka. I think it's d'abord je voudrais remercier tous les présentateurs et les présentatrices d'avoir en fait eu le courage de partager des idées diverses et différentes. Et c'était un peu l'intention de proposer ce dialogue, proposer ce forum. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for having the courage to actually share all these diverging and interest and different perspectives on this very important but often difficult to express topic. So I just want to draw your attention to the question that Charlie Mambala has asked, and I think it's in the chat. So maybe Olenka, maybe you missed that one. He's asking about the what one needs to create the dialogue, this environment, not for dialogue but also for diversity. He asks, it's also important to create an appropriate environment and adequate conditions for diversity. So how does one create that? I would like to ask the question on Charlie's behalf to our presenters.
Thanks, Srilata. I did miss that. Apologies, Charlie. Very important question. So how can we create an appropriate environment and adequate conditions for diversity?
May I try?
Yes, please, Alphonse.
Yes, I think the first thing that I will say is that, first of all, we should be courageous. And we should also need to be humble, because the colonial approach is essentially arrogant. And the colonial approach thinks that nobody can teach him anything. And when you come here in Canada, for instance, you have everything to learn from Canada and you have everything to expect from Canada, but you will not bring something very important. And that's what we're trying to avoid here, for instance, in doing settlement. We try to avoid looking at the newcomers like somebody who has everything, who expects everything from Canada, that has anything to bring to Canada. In the contrary, we want to be in a humble position where we say, okay, we know that you have come here. You also have an experience, you have strength, you have a lot of things. What can you bring to the community, please? You have this. This is your turn. Do whatever you can do for the community. And we have newcomers that will start, presenting things right the second or the third day here in Canada. He will start speaking to people, explaining his experience, sharing things with a lot of people. And this, we have noticed that this client will adjust very quickly because they were empowered right at the beginning. So I think we need to be courageous and humble so that we can allow other people to have their say to our living together. Yeah.
Thank you. Question in the chat. Ifeoma, did you want to comment?
Okay, no, I didn't want to comment. I just wanted to ask a question.
Please.
Okay, I think my question is to Carrie Ocher. I think she gave the analogy of separate canoes, but the shared river. People traveling in different canoes down the river, and at some point, could they share? But I thought that multiculturalism meant that we're all traveling in one boat. Maybe if the canoes are too small to take us all, well, you make a bigger boat, because we are all going in the same direction, destination as a country, in my view. So instead of you going that way in your little boat and I'm going that way, and we could cooperate maybe by fixing there's any problem, boats in the engine or the hulls. I'm thinking that multiculturalism means that we've decided to go this road together. Coming from different directions, different countries, different cultures here, people have come to meet the indigenous here, and they are part of the landscape now. People are still coming, immigrants, now present day immigrants are still coming. And they're still going to form part of the landscape. So we're in one boat, traveling down this river. We are going to the same direction. And what I mean by the same destiny or the same destination means that what you want for yourself is what I want for myself. What you want for your children, for your generation, is exactly what I want for myself too. So we are in the same boat, and we should be able to manage ourselves within that one boat. Because if you consider that you are in your boat, I'm in my boat, okay, we are going. Well, I don't know. That means we don't have the same destiny. That means we are still different people. We are still different people in one Canada. We are not Canadians. But if we could make the boat bigger, the opportunities bigger, whatever, the good life bigger, so that all of us can be there, we cooperate, and then enjoy the fruits of that labor. So that's my question to Carrie. You're talking of different canoes going down the same river, sharing the one river, but I'm thinking of one big boat that can take all of us. Thank you.
Carrie.
That's a big, I'm gonna just have to speak truthfully here. And I know that it's going to be very uncomfortable for people, but I think right now as an Indigenous person, I'm not speaking on behalf of all Indigenous peoples, but the struggle that I have as an Indigenous person in a colonized country is not the same struggle that everybody has in this boat. If we were all going together in a boat together, it would immediately take away all of the things that our people are trying to regain right now. I think that we forget that all of this, including this overarching, so-called Canada, is not our system. They were unilaterally imposed over all Indigenous peoples during settlement. So the laws and the systems that guide multiculturalism, have done so forcefully and violently against our peoples. So we can't go in the same boat when it comes to us reclaiming our space as Indigenous peoples who come from this place originally. We would never in this day and age go into another country right now and say, get in our boat, follow our laws, this is our rule. I mean, it happens around the world, but that's what's happening right now to Indigenous peoples, is that multiculturalism and all Canadian policies are unilaterally telling us what we can do, what we can't do. And basically have said that actually everything that you've had before doesn't matter. Get in this boat. This is the way that we're going. All these other people, they'll come into this boat too. So I know that multiculturalism proposes that we can exist as unique and separate entities, but ultimately we cannot, not in the way that it's imagined. We want the same goals. We want to be treated with dignity. We want to be treated with respect. We want to be responsible and take care of our relations. But what that means in reality, grounded in this place, is very, very different. You know, there are people in all over Canada, so-called Canada right now, Indigenous groups that are facing extreme violence from industry, from government, like actually getting like quite literally thrown into prison for trying to protect their land, unceded territory, not even legally owned by Canada. So it's just, we're not there. I know we want to be there, we're not there. So we need our canoe. We need to be able to take care of our relations the way that Creator always meant for us to, before we can even consider, you know, like getting into a boat that supposedly is towards the same goal. That's how I feel about it.
Thanks, Carrie. A few more questions and comments. This is for everyone, particularly Carrie and Dwayne. Ultimately, one of the common grounds all of us here has is literally the ground, as in the land. From your own traditions, what are things you've done or seen done that honors and recognizes the importance of land?
Thanks for that question, Jen. I'll quickly share a few things, and maybe some other folks who want to also respond. First of all, I would say I would include land, but I would also include the air, the sky, the water, the wind. Those are all those things that we've been taught to pay attention to in those networks of relationships that we depend upon for our survival. What I've done, you know, had a chance to be guided by, you know, our Giteak, these people who hold wisdom in this area. And I've had the chance to guide university students. It's a course I teach with the old man. It's called Holistic Approaches to Life and Living. And it's diverse groups of students that attend the class. And we meet together for a whole trip around the sun. So through the 4 seasons, all 13 moons. And this is what the old man told me. He said to me, the most important thing you can do in your life and your work is connect people to the gifts that exist in the place where they live. Because when you do that, they're more likely to see it as part of themselves as human beings, whoever they are, wherever they come from. And when they see it as part of themselves, they're going to want to protect it because they'll see it as sacred and connected to their own lives in very practical ways. He said, when that happens, then that's when we can come alongside each other as human beings. We recognize each other as human beings. And so those, you know, that's my intention. That's my purpose with that course. Just to give a quick example, one of the things we pay attention to in the context of this course is the lunar calendar that exists here, which of course is quite different from the Gregorian calendar. So this moon that we are currently in the Hiawiwan, it's known as Kitsipi Sim. think this is very relevant to what we're talking about. Kiitsi pisim. So kiitsi in the language, what it refers to is something so big, so large that it's you can't really imagine it. And so that kiitsi is connected to what we call the creator, the great mystery, kiitsi mantu. So this moon is connected to the creator, and it's also connected to kiitsi watsuin, which is how you say kindness or compassion. So what we learn in that wisdom way is that this is the time of year when we have to be the most kind and the most compassionate, because it's the most difficult time of year, not just for humans, for every form of life. And so it's just getting into those rhythms and exposing students, diverse groups of students to that, that's really gave meaning to their lives. And for many of them, it's about learning how to live well here. And that's, to me, that's very different from multiculturalism.
Thank you, Dwayne. There are a number of other comments in the chat that I'm not sure are all exactly questions. Larissa, please. And then Dulari in a minute.
Before mentioning wonderful initiative of the collaboration of the City of Edmonton with Indigenous peoples, I also wanted to recognize that, well, I heard it and then it struck me that together with this idea that we have to engage Indigenous people in everything we do, what concerns, we have to be very, very careful, because it must be exhausting for Indigenous people to be called on about everything. Any idea, and so they're just side note. But the wonderful, the initiative of the City of Edmonton is the Indigenous ward naming project, right? That led by women matriarchs, Indigenous women. And I think if you haven't seen that very, very short video of how they introduced the project, please do. And again, refer to Roxanne to do this. She says, is the world ready for this? And I think they made the world ready for this. It is, I think, there's a great example of what we can do and what was done.
Thank you. Dulari, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. My question is both to Carrie and to Dwayne. I found both your presentations very interesting and informative and inspiring. It's just an idea. I've been an immigrant here for over 50 years, and I've been very active in community work. I have worked a lot in the Francophone community and seeking ways to have the Francophone immigrants recognized, not necessarily always as settlers and newcomers, but as agents, as contributors in that society. Now, my question to both of you is, in course of my community work, I have come to appreciate, to respect both the teachings, both what you can learn from the Indigenous communities. At the university, actually, when I came, we did host. My husband was instrumental in helping to host, for the first time maybe, a conference in which many Indigenous people participated. It was a way to bring together the different religions at the time. But my question to you today, after all these years, is, would it be asking too much of you to help us get out of this colonial framework that we all are growing up in, we brought it here partly because we came from colonized territories, but we are here, and some of us anyway have tried to get out of that framework, and we would like to learn more from the Indigenous population. So do you envisage, is it asking you too much to also try to reach some of us and transmit this message that you are giving now, to forcing us to look at our experience in Canada, not only as settlers, as takers from this society, but also as people who can share, have common experiences, and we can all move in a direction which will take us away from this competition, from trying to bring each other down to get a few more dollars here and there. Instead of that kind of divisiveness, but to build towards a future where we can contribute wholly as human beings for a future, for a bright future for the children, in which we can share these actions in a spirit of common participation. Well, that was what I had to say. Thank you very much. I'd appreciate some thoughts on it. If not now, maybe later. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Dwayne or Carrie, I think that initially was directed to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm understanding that you're, Delora, you're asking a little bit about it, like whether or not it's okay to continue to ask Indigenous peoples to provide like teachings and learnings and educational on this topic for other communities to learn. Is that correct? Am I understanding that accurately? Oh, you're on mute.
I think the head nod means yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, I was just like reading, like I was saying last night, The Unjust Society by Harold Cardinal, and I had never read it in its entirety. I just knew that when I was doing this presentation, it was going to have some good medicine in it for me. So I power read it yesterday. And, it's interesting because it was written just as a response to the white paper in 1969 and then a forward in 1999. And largely so many of the issues Indigenous peoples are facing was the same, obviously with some changes, but what really struck me was when Harold was talking about organizing and how the expectation of Indigenous peoples to organize was always unpaid work, and there was all these barriers to them organizing, right? And I just think about how that still sort of exists today in all of the organizing work that I do. There's so much, for me specific, I won't speak for everyone, there's so much that goes into these presentations, so much care, so much time, so much energy and heart and love. And it is, it's really tiring and exhausting, to be honest, sometimes to be in these spaces because you carry so much of the weight of this work. I'm really grateful, and I told Dwayne that I'm happy that he's here because often it's one person in isolation who has to carry the weight of these conversations. And thank you for Larissa for noting that. I hope that Indigenous peoples always have the agency and they understand and know what they can take on and have boundaries to be able to say yes or no. And hopefully institutions will always be able to support, whether it's financially or in other ways, Indigenous peoples to continue to do this work. So if you have institutions, for example, who can increase the amount of Indigenous peoples doing that work, that's an amazing step forward. So that's not one person always sort of doing that. And then just trusting that the people who are able to, who have the capacities, will be able to show up in these spaces to continue to do this work when they're resourced, through their practices, through their communities, things like that.
Dwayne?
I've already had lots of opportunities to share. I'd really like to hear from some other folks who haven't had a chance to say too much yet.
well, can I just say something? Carrie, I'm glad you mentioned the notion of time and money and everything else. Many of us get taken up with this idea of community work and volunteering. And that takes time, energy, and sacrifice. And I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
And just before we bring to a close, Natalia, please.
Carrie, Dwayne, and others, I am following this discussion with much attention. And I wanted to thank you in particular for doing this work you were saying that needs to be done, but that oftentimes results in being single person or one in a larger audience. I do come from that crop of academics who have benefited tremendously from that work. And I wanted just to express my gratitude to elders who have taught me in various ways to be who I am today. I have spent a lot of time at the University of Saskatchewan, and I've learned in official settings and also unofficial settings from such esteemed people as Marie Baptiste, Maria Campbell, Alan Adam, Dinesh Scholar, and elder who I worked closely with. And it's true, oftentimes those are the university orchestrated opportunities, and if they're done thoughtfully and meaningfully, they have an impact. The work we undertake on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Imelda and others, is informed by our relations, which have been very, very meaningful. So I just wanted to tell you that it would be important to see this work continued. You did bring, Carrie, up the words resources, which have been sitting here and thinking too. We're not talking about that for a number of reasons, but it is one of the key words and one of the key reasons why we may be stumbling over reaching a better path or coordinating our boats going down the long that mighty river we are hoping to call Canada still. The multiculturalism as a policy have been paternalistic, has been colonial by its core, but also it needed to happen in the eyes of the government so they can, figure out how to distribute resources. And by the nature of the policy, it's always attached with budgets and resources. So it's one of the tricky and painful points, especially I imagine from the position of Indigenous peoples when we have so much racism going on, so much discrimination going on the ground and being so under-resourced. And today we also focused, thankfully, on a very important topic of land, another very large and very looming conversation we know is of importance to our Indigenous partners. And it is going to continue being an important conversation. I don't want to attach the word resources to land, but land is the grounding point for Indigenous peoples to start with, and for many of us as well who have benefited from being farmers in this land, like Ukrainian Canadians. I think, and ultimately where I'm heading with all that is that we may not find something quickly of a fix, but if we continue sharing and building dialogue along the lines, with an understanding that aspirationally we do want to arrive somewhere, and meanwhile, let's do it in a respectful way of trying to listen and hear each other. Maybe one person at a time, maybe one community at a time, but we cannot do it without our Indigenous peoples in our efforts to move forward with that. So I wanted to thank you for being in this room with us from really bottom of my heart, and with my thoughts going back to other elders who have taught me to be in my place today. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And as one of the co-organizers, I think you have nicely brought this morning's dialogue to a temporary close. And what I mean by that is that while we will have to close this formal part of the morning, we will be able to continue our discussion in a breakout room shortly. I do want to thank each of our presenters today for the deep thought that they gave in preparing their presentations, for their time and heart, and for sharing their truths. And I think that's what will help make our dialogue continue to move forward. We know that some of you may have to leave now, and we'd like to express our deepest gratitude for your interest and contribution toward the symposium session. We trust that you are all departing with a continued sense of curiosity toward multiculturalism in Canada, and hopefully inspiration of how you might practically involve yourself in the very real and active work of reconciliation. We hope all of you will also be able to join us later today for our second literary keynote talk with the wonderful Louise Bernice Half. Louise is the current Parliamentary Poet Laureate, and she will be reading from a selection of her works and discussing how her poems have addressed the realities of both an inclusive, multicultural Canada and an exclusionary and harmful culture-destroying Canada. She will also be taking questions from the audience. The Zoom link for Louise's keynote will now be placed in the chat, and you may also access this link from the Reconciling Multiculturalism in Today's Canada website, which will also be shared in the chat. Please take notice that the Zoom link for this literary keynote is different from the Zoom link used to access this morning's roundtable. Thank you all again for participating in this community roundtable. If you have decided that you would still like to continue this dialogue, you will now be transferred to the discussion lounge. And I notice that Natalia has her hand up again. Natalia, please.
Thank you. I know Olenka is the chair of this session, and she pointed out as we tried to overall outline the direction of our work in this symposium that we are thoughtfully and in a concerted effort moved on away from theoretical debates towards this very, very important discussion. I wanted to point out that we do not envision the end of this work with the end of the symposium. Rather, as I've pointed out in the chat, this is the beginning. We are to maintain the conversations in a digital format. So we'll have a footprint out there with these dialogues to be on. We are working on publications as well. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch with you all and working on that very post-symposium follow-up together. So thank you so much. And unfortunately, I think Srilata and I will have to leave in a number of minutes for another symposium-related meeting, but we did enjoy other breakout room conversations tremendously, and we really encourage you to continue on where there will be no recording, where we can frankly, again, maybe address those very key points which we've been discussing in the official part of our presentations today. Thank you yet again.
Thank you. Merci. Tous et à toutes.
So watch for your invitation to go to a different room. Grant, can you issue me that again? I thought I pressed the button, but I didn't.
Me too. I honestly don't know where I am now. I think we're still in the main meeting room.
You're in the main meeting. Just click on the breakout rooms.
Yes, please.
No, click on the breakout room button and then slide down to discussion lounge and go there.
Yeah. All right. So join.
Yep.
Let's see how many people go there. Yes.
Thanks, Claire.
There we go.
Okay, Claire, I'm going to stop the computer and come back. Another one, it starts 3 o'clock. Maybe 3:30?
Yeah, we'll start it at 2:30-ish.
What do you mean? No, the keynote started at 4:00.
Yes, I know, but they're having kind of a discussion lounge at 3 to 4 with that
No,
session.
that's a different link.
No, it's not. It's the same link. If you look at Jen's email.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Then you might have to kind of.
Yeah. Oh, if you look in the agenda.
I saw it.
So it's the same link for those two because they're connected in time. So I'll start it at 2:30-ish.
Okay.
Or maybe 2:45. Let's say that.
You know what? Maybe 2:30. 2:30. Okay, I'm gonna stop.
Okay. Yeah, you can go. I'll continue to monitor this and.
Yeah, then that's computers that convert.
Yeah.
Back?
Yeah, I'll go out with this other machine and let it do its work too. Oh, I also